can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sand. And right now, I feel like 100 grand.
You are listening to Inspired Insider with your host, Dr. Jeremy Wise.
Dr. Jeremy Weiss here, founder of InspiredInsider.com, where I talk with inspirational entrepreneurs and leaders. Today is no different. I have Nicholas Lalla. You can check him out at nicholaslalla.com. We'll be talking about Tulsa Innovation Labs.com, his book, Reinventing the Heartland. And Nick, before I formally introduce you, I always like to point out other episodes of the podcast people should check out. Since it's kind of like Tulsa themed here, I was like looking, what other episodes are Tulsa entrepreneurs, right? It's appropriate. I had Matt Zalk of Key Renter Property Management, who talked about real estate investment. I met him through actually EO Tulsa. I had the Lisa Riley. We talked about the grind, the trepidation, risk of being a new entrepreneur, also in Tulsa, of course, and David Littlefield and Sam Littlefield, Littlefield Agency. And we talked about how to transition to the next generation in a family business. So all those Tulsa businesses, entrepreneurs. So people can check those out, right?
I love all the Tulsa connections.
Yeah, 100%. This episode is brought to you by Rise 25. At Rise 25, we help businesses give to and connect their dream relationships and partnerships. We do this in two ways. One, we help companies launch and run their podcast. We're an easy button for a company to launch and run a podcast. We do the strategy, the accountability, and the full execution and production. Number two, we're an easy button for your company's corporate gifting. We make gifting and staying top of mind to your clients, partners, or prospects simple, seamless, and for me, Nick, affordable. You know, I want it to be affordable sending to the people, you know, because I always want to stay in touch with people. And we do everything from the gift selection, the card, to your branding. And basically, it's just, we call ourselves the magic elves that run in the background to make it easy for your company to build amazing relationships with those things. So, you know, for me, I'm always looking at ways on how I can give to my best relationships. And I found no better way over the past decade on the podcast and, you know, sending follow-up gifts to people I want to stay in touch with in my universe. You can go to rise25.com to learn more. I'm excited to introduce Nicholas Lalla. I guess, Nick, I'm trying to how do we categorize you, right? An urbanist and social entrepreneur. And Nick works at the intersection of economic development and emerging technology. And really what he does is he partners with cities to build strategies and initiatives that catalyze growth. Okay. He helped found Tulsa Innovation Labs, which is an organization deploying over $200 million to build Northeast Oklahoma's innovation economy. Previously, he actually led Cyber NYC for the New York City Economic Development Corporation, and which is a cybersecurity initiative the New York Times called among the nation's most ambitious. He's also the author, as I mentioned, of Reinventing the Heartland, how one city's inclusive approach to innovation and growth can revive the American dream. Nick, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to start with the origin of Tulsa Innovation Labs.
Yeah, so this was 2018, I believe. I was leading the cornerstone initiative of Mayor Bill de Blasio's jobs plan, which you just referenced, an initiative called Cyber NYC. This was a $30 million public-private investment in New York's cyber ecosystem. And we got really good press, some New York Times, Wall Street Journal coverage. And this random philanthropy in Northeast Oklahoma picked up on it. And I got a cold email one day from my company's president saying, hey, this philanthropy's in town. They would love to talk to you about Cyber NYC. And I said, sure, that's, of course, happy to take the conversation. That's my job. And they came down to FIDI and spoke with the George Kaiser Family Foundation. And in that initial conversation, they asked, have you ever thought about Tulsa? And humbly,
there's an obvious answer with that.
I was like, to be honest with you, I haven't thought about Tulsa. I was born and raised in New Orleans. Oklahoma is just a hop, skip, and a jump from from Louisiana, but had never been to Oklahoma. Didn't really know where Tulsa was geographically. Thought it was more southwestern than it is, but was intrigued by that initial conversation, which focused on, hey, how do we create a cyber investment in Tulsa, Oklahoma? And so I visited the city. It is wonderfully green. It's just a beautiful town at the base of the Ozarks, and met with key stakeholders, the philanthropy, civic leaders, real estate developers, university deans and professors, the mayor and his team, Chamber of Commerce, and realized that a single investment in cyber wasn't really going to move the needle, particularly an undiligenced investment in an emerging tech cluster like cyber wasn't really going to change Tulsa's trajectory. And through a series of conversations and site visits, I ended up pitching the George Kaiser Family Foundation's board of directors on a vision for tech-led and inclusive growth in the Northeast Oklahoma region. Essentially, how do you build a tech economy from scratch? I thought that the city needed to go bigger, bolder, more systems wide. They needed to find what I called their city's tech niche, those handful of innovation clusters that represent the strongest opportunities for growth. And GKFF, the foundation, said, that sounds like a really good idea. How about you come lead that effort? And so in the fall of 2019, I left my happy little life on the Upper East Side of Manhattan and moved out to Tulsa, Oklahoma. And we spun out Tulsa Innovation Labs just a few months later.
Was there a timeline? And by the way, if anyone's watching the video, listening to the audio, there's a video piece and we're kind of poking around here. Was there a timeline? You know, like they're telling you, okay, you're going to move to Tulsa, right? You're from New York, or you're living in New York, right? It's a lot different. What do you what are they saying or thinking the timeline is going to be?
That's a really good question.
I
For a
mean,
few
you'd be
different
like, oh,
reasons.
you're just going to be there for 10 years. I mean, I don't know. What were you thinking?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. Um, and the timeline operates on a few different levels. One level is for me as an individual leader, my career, my professional life, my personal life. Um, I honestly thought that this would be for Nick a 2-year type of gig where I would stand it up and then leave. Um, that kind of fit with how I thought I saw my career trajectory playing out. What I realized even in those early days was two things. One is that Tulsa, on the one hand, Tulsa didn't have 10 years to get its act together, that there were warning signs already flashing 5 or so years ago where key indicators showed Tulsa lagging behind even regional peers. Continuing volatility in its legacy industries, oil and gas, the struggle to build any type of entrepreneurial ecosystem, brain drain, et cetera. And so I didn't think Tulsa had 10 years to get its act together. I knew that I wanted to make a step change in the city's history. And so for me, the posture that I took as a founder and as a leader, and there are pros and cons to this approach, was we're going to make as much impact and challenge the status quo as quickly as possible. That I really saw this as a 2-year type of project. I have the vision, let's build a strategy, let's raise a lot of money and start deploying it immediately. At the same time, though, I recognized that to achieve long-term and sustainable outcomes, that this would be a 10 to 25-year project, right? And so aligning those different timelines and how I positioned myself as a leader, how I positioned Tulsa Innovation Labs, how we built partnerships, how we built relationships, was candidly a little complicated given given those competing timelines, right? I didn't have 5 years to make best friends with university president X or politician Y, right? I needed to make fast alliances because I wanted to do big things in a short amount of time. And I sensed an opportunity both with the foundation's interest and the Biden administration's historic investments in place-based economic development.
You know, a couple things stick out. I do want to dig in. We will dig into, I know you talk about in the book, your leadership journey, right? And we will dig into that. But I want to it's really fascinating to me. I want to talk about the pitch, right? Like you say it kind of casually, but like this is a huge deal. When you're pitching this thing, this is like going to create a lot of funds and jobs and future, growth for a city. And then I want to talk about you get it. And what do you do first? Like, I wouldn't even know where to start. I mean, there's a lot of things like, do you get a space? Do you get people? So start with the pitch for a second. What do you make sure that you included in the pitch to the foundation that made this, successful? Because without that, nothing else happens.
Yeah. So I did a few things. One is I explained my work in New York City, and the importance of taking a strategic and data-driven and focused approach to economic development, really focusing in on identifying the strongest opportunities for growth, specific industry clusters, and then deploying capital vis-a-vis initiatives, projects, programs that stimulate growth and activity in those clusters in a coordinated way. And so for my work in New York, for example, Cyber NYC wasn't a singular or siloed investment. It was a suite of investments that touched academic innovation, that touched workforce development, that touched startups and corporate innovation. And we created in New York an initiative whose individual components interlocked and fed into one another, right? Talent is fueling startups. A venture fund is fueling the startups. Startups are creating more jobs. They're partnering with the universities to commercialize IP. This is kind of the classic innovation flywheel approach. And so I explained the work that I was doing in New York, and very quickly kind of reiterated, because they heard it before, the warning signs about the region's economy, right? And they know and knew that if Tulsa didn't diversify its economy, didn't transition from its oil and gas legacy to tech, that they were going to get left behind, right? They knew that. I didn't have to press that case too hard. And then the crux of the presentation was, let's find Tulsa's tech niche, right? What are those handful of opportunities that represent the strongest opportunities for tech-led and inclusive growth for Tulsa, right? This isn't Nick taking what he did in New York and lifting and shifting it to Tulsa. This is finding the city's own special place in the innovation economy. And it's based on local assets, existing industries. It builds a bridge to emerging technologies that are adjacent to those legacy industries. They represent opportunities that offer a diversity of jobs across a range of educational attainment levels as a good proxy for inclusion. And those are opportunities that allow the city to lead, not play some supporting role, right? And I basically said, look, and remember the conversation started with cyber. I didn't say this in so many words, but I was like, let's actually diligence cyber as an opportunity. Nobody has actually done any type of quantitative study to figure out if cyber is worth investing in the first place. And it was based on the idea, the feeling that the University of Tulsa had a really strong and underutilized cyber program, which turned out to be very true. But Nick, as the newcomer, nobody was pointing to studies or data or any hard evidence that was the case. I was hearing a lot of feelings and hopes and aspirations. And so I basically said, look, we need to conduct an industry cluster strategy that found those kernels of opportunities across the region. And instead of dispersing capital, taking a scattershot approach, which I had heard Tulsa had been doing for quite some time to little results, we needed to go big on a handful of opportunities, raise a lot of money, get that money out the door in a smart and methodical way to build those clusters. If I'm being really honest with you, and I don't quite say this in the book, but you have to remember that this was like 5-6 years ago. They don't know me from Adam. I don't think that I know that it sounded very theoretical to the foundation, right? And there was no guaranteed promises. It's not like they wrote a blank check or said, we're going to commit $100 million to this effort. It was like, okay, that sounds really promising. How about you lead it and we'll see how it goes, right? And then the hard work happens after that.
Yeah, thanks for walking me through that. I'm going to so I want to go through, what do you do next, right? What do you do first? But I want to just, in my mind, kind of summarize generally what you said there, which is there's social proof there that you included from like all the past success. There's a plan based on data that you shared. You shared some of the pain points of what's going on. You also identified some solutions. Again, all this kind of is based in specific data. And then you shared what the future looks like. You kind of paint a picture of what the future looks like. And also in that identified solution, you talked about specific niches and things like that. So I like kind of how you always go back to the data, right? Because it's all supported in what you're saying. So what do you do first? So they're like, okay, Nick, let's do this. Right? Where do you start? Yeah. And what are some of the big pieces you have to put in place here?
Yeah. Before I jump into that,
go.
Let me just underline an important point that you made, which is, and I do stress in the book, which is the importance of a forward-looking and positive vision. I was speaking to a civic leader in another city one day, and the deck that they gave me, like the first or second slide, literally had like 10 bullet points with the worst statistics about their own hometown. And this was a deck and a conversation meant to get me excited about working with that city. And I know the data points in my hometown of New Orleans. I know them from New Orleans. I know that cities out there are struggling, that no city is perfect, that particularly mid-sized cities in the heartland, a goodly number of them are struggling. But it sets cities up for failure and doesn't inspire investment or change if you focus on the negative. And that's honestly something that I also kind of had to learn as a leader when I built Tulsa Innovation Labs, is to not try to solve problems, but unlock opportunities, right? So I think that's an important point, just underscoring.
No, thanks for pointing that out, because it is a fine line and a balance, right? Because people do want to highlight the pain points, right? Because what's the point of solving a problem? But the positive vision, if it's overwhelming about the pain points, then you're like, hey, the crime rate's terrible, all these things. You're like, well, why do I don't want to go there, right? After you
right. And for me, it's like, I can't build on a crime rate statistic. That's not like, what am I going to do with that? Right. Like, I want you to give me the 10 strongest stats about your city, the 10 strongest, most creative, interesting, valuable assets that your city has to offer. Let's figure out what those things are and then build a vision and a strategy and a vision for shared growth around all that. Right. You can't build off of the negative. Even though it's important not to whitewash stuff like that, right? and those data points can help steer investment. But when you're building a shared vision for growth, you got to start with the positive. You got to start with what a city has, not what it doesn't have. And I firmly believe that every city has assets on which to build. So getting back to your question, it was multiple things in parallel. One was building an organizational architecture for Tulsa Innovation Labs. What form would this actually take? Is it a division within the foundation? Is it a 501c3? Is it an LLC? Is it something else? We ultimately settled on an LLC nested under the foundation, which I think was the right decision at the time. And then second was, I'm a workaholic, but this cannot be the Nick show. This needs to be a team effort. So I very quickly built a team. You're seeing one of my second hire, Jennifer Hankins. My first hire, maybe if you scroll down, is a guy named Castle Jones, who's awesome. So I built a team, and very early on recognized the importance of hiring the very best talent that I could get. That one of the things Tulsa was lacking was young, fresh, super sophisticated, ambitious, and creative economic developers. And so I built a literal dream team over time, but started with those first two hires.
How do you find the people?
And it's a combination of
hiring is difficult.
It's super hard. It's super hard. It's extraordinarily difficult, particularly in kind of this weird little field that I'm in, right? In a region that doesn't have a whole lot of precedent doing the type of tech-led economic development that I wanted to do. We hired locally. We engaged executive recruiters. We posted on LinkedIn, jobs boards. What's funny about my first hire, Castle Jones, is he was working at an organization. He's from the Tulsa region, actually, but he was in New York at the same time that I was in New York, working at an organization called Endeavor, and randomly applied for the job. And I'm looking at his resume, and he's, super brilliant, BA from Johns Hopkins, went to London School of Economics, from Oklahoma, living in New York at an innovation organization. And I'm like, well, shit, this guy's great. And so he was my first hire. I got him back to Tulsa, and he ended up leading, developing our energy tech initiative and spinning that out and running the startup accelerator. So can't speak highly enough, more highly of the team. That is really a critical component, because it made everything else easier when Tulsa Innovation Labs, is a brand new organization led by a total outsider like myself, oozes competence and credibility. Like, people knew that we were going to get the work done and that we respected them, and we did it in a spirit of partnership. So terribly important. The third stream in building Tulsa Innovation Labs was getting to work on figuring out what is Tulsa's tech niche. What are those opportunities for growth? And what Jen and Castle and myself realized, which is a realization that a lot of cities come to, begrudgingly so, is, we needed a consultant. We didn't have the access to large databases, much less the time and staff capacity to analyze it as rigorously as we needed to. New York City Economic Development Corporation, where I'd come from, has an entire team around data and internal strategy consultants, essentially. And I'm building a baby version of that in Northeast Oklahoma. So we knew that getting the strategy right, which would essentially define our investment thesis, was mission critical to all of this. And because we're backed by a $6 billion philanthropy, and thought that we could raise a lot of money. We needed to get it right, and hired McKinsey to help us analyze the data. And I'll say a few things on that. One is, I do think that it's important to make data-driven decisions. I don't think cities need to hire McKinsey level consultants for something like this. I think there's a ton of consultants out there, independent, mid-range, that do really good work in this space. But the higher quality the data, the better the decision making. What the TIL team did effectively in parallel and in partnership with our consultant was engage stakeholders, conduct stakeholder interviews, contextualize the data that our consultants were finding, translating it into actionable insights. And McKinsey aren't economic developers or urbanists. That's what TIL is about, right? So they can tell us the compound annual growth rate of whatever. My team can then say, okay, here's what we actually do about that, right? And how do we connect it to the community? And I think that made for a really effective partnership. We interviewed over 100 stakeholders throughout that process, all of our key corporates, all of our key universities, our philanthropies, our large startups, and others, and tried to build what I call a shared vision for growth over 6 months or so. And then in June 2020, during the pandemic, we released our foundational strategy, what I call Tulsa's tech niche. It identified virtual health, energy tech, advanced air mobility, and cyber as the region's strongest opportunities for growth, all built on local assets and drawing on existing legacy industries.
I know, Nicholas, before we hit record, we were talking about this. So it's like, okay, hiring people, because there's a timeline. It's interesting. This mimics any company, really. We're thinking, okay, you're hiring and you're already going into mindset, which makes sense. Is like, okay, there's a timeline here. I need to put these amazing people in place because I have a timeline on when I'm going to be stepping away. And then the second thing, which is interesting, is the niche, right? Going into what's going to give the greatest chance for success and focus. So I'd love to talk about some of the exercises people can think in their own mind around this topic. And I remember I had Corey Quinn on. It's interesting you say this. He wrote the book, Anyone, Not Everyone, A Proven System to Escape Founder-Led Sales. And he really focused on agencies and helping digital agencies find their niche. And then that allows them to really get to the next level. And so I'd love to hear, what are some of the exercises people should be thinking about when they're trying to figure out their niche, or in this case, Tulsa Innovation Labs?
Yeah. I think it's a few things. And one is an important mindset shift at the very beginning, which is that cities, mid-sized cities in the Heartland in particular, can't compare themselves or compete with San Francisco and New York. And some cities, I think, believe that they can. Other cities think that New York and San Francisco have the monopoly. My town in Missouri or Kansas can't possibly carve out our space in tech. And I think both are fundamentally untrue. And so one of the things that we had to combat early on was a jadedness to civic leaders that either didn't believe, they loved their hometown, but didn't believe that Tulsa had what it takes to become a tech hub, and or had gone down this road before where folks had tried to raise money for tech-led economic development and wasted money, didn't get the results that they wanted. So there was some history that we had to kind of combat in at the very beginning. That's why I think the fresh approach that I brought was so well received. Finding your technician. So the first step is basic landscape assessment of the region, right? You'd be surprised that, I talked to the 100, 200 most influential, powerful, impactful, whatever word you want to use, leader in Tulsa. And even a mid-sized city like Tulsa, people have blind spots and gaps in their own knowledge and their own experience. Half the town doesn't know what the other half is doing. You get outside of city proper, there's a gap between the urban and the rural. And so it's important to be comprehensive. It's important to take a regional approach to economic development and to really scan the region for economic development related assets. And, and to be comprehensive about it, right? It's not just innovation related assets, big data sets, startup accelerators, infrastructure, real estate, convenings, community centers, libraries, Air Force bases, LGBTQ plus centers, workforce training boot camps, venture capital firms, banks, right? Like you need to scan the region for assets that you think you can leverage to unlock growth, right? And maybe would it be helpful if I give you just a few examples across each of the kind of 4 focus areas that we landed on, maybe just as illustrative example? Yeah. So in virtual health, we identified telemedicine practices at our local universities. This popped even before COVID emerged. We recognized that the rural communities surrounding Tulsa lacked access to healthcare, and we saw an opportunity to beef up academic innovation and support commercialization of that innovation in the virtual health space. Energy tech, obviously, Tulsa is the former oil capital of the world. You have Fortune 500s in oil and gas. Energy tech is a pretty obvious example, but you have a corporate base already there, but they weren't working with startups. So they weren't attracting startups to town. They weren't innovating internally. And so we saw that as a great opportunity. Advanced air mobility, this is a really interesting one. And the kind of shocker for the Tulsa Innovation Labs team. Oklahoma has a large aerospace presence, mostly in maintenance, repair, and overhaul. So like fixing planes and engines, but not tech per se. But you have American Airlines, you have Spirit there in the region. So you have an incumbent workforce that has familiarity with the aviation industry. You have Oklahoma State University has a top-ranked unmanned aerial systems research center. And you have oil and gas companies and agriculture companies using drones to monitor pipelines and crops respectively. And then another really fascinating asset that we discovered outside of city proper was a plot of land called Skyway 36, owned and operated by the Osage Nation, one of Tulsa's local Native American tribes. And they were building a drone port on that native sovereign land to test drones. And Tulsa Innovation Labs' job is to identify those assets, recognize their potential, and build the connective tissue around them and invest in them to generate jobs, right? And then in cyber, turned out that the cyber hypothesis was validated. The University of Tulsa indeed has a top 25 program in cyber, continuously recognized by the National Security Agency. Cyber is also a critical enabler to virtual health, energy tech, and advanced air mobility. So we saw some synergies with that niche. But it took interviews, site visits, rigorous research and analysis to identify all of those assets and then figure out how to build the vision around them.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. I think again, it's instructive, I think, for any company, to be honest with you, to think about these things, right? A lot of the companies I have on, they start with one niche and then they're kind of just experimenting and there's a lot of research behind it to get it to it quicker, faster, better, most likely. So there's hiring, figuring out the niche. What's next? What do you do next?
Well, then I need to raise money. That's the if you see gray hairs, that's where I got them. Um, yeah, that's the hardest part. That's the hardest part, because economic development takes money. I mean, it just costs money to do, right? And
And you kind of, I
the
don't know, Nick, if you got I mean, you get a soft yes in the beginning. I mean, is that, I don't know what you consider like, yeah, go do it, and then we'll think about it type of thing.
I got a little better. I got a soft yes that our philanthropic backer would cover Tulsa Innovation Labs as OpEx. What exactly that meant over what period of time wasn't 100% clear, but I felt confident and secure knowing that I had a philanthropic backer to give me some runway, which was super important. Um, I think what we did effectively was bring key stakeholders on the journey with us. So I met them the first time I went to Tulsa. I pitched many of them who sit on the board of directors at GKFF. We included them in the strategic planning process. And the whole point of the strategic planning process is to identify barriers in part to their growth, right? When
They have an invested interest
our
in this, right? I mean, because they're in the
absolutely
area and
they need tech talent. They want to work with startups. They want to pilot emerging technologies. They recognize that, right? And so we included them in the very beginning, and in that process, identified specific investments that we can make together that would drive catalytic growth and impact, both for them, their bottom line, and for Tulsa Innovation Labs, which is interested in job creation, economic mobility. Um, and so what we did was across the four or five different foci, we had a handful of initiatives slash investments in development, and we fundraised, kind of on an ad hoc, project by project, initiative basis, based on interest from local stakeholders, the philanthropy, others. And maybe I give you, just a couple examples of how we kind of cobbled together so much money in 4 years. So I mentioned Energy Tech and Castle Jones, and I was just texting with him last night, so that's why he's like top of mind. Castle are Fortune 500s in oil and gas. And the gap in Tulsa in energy tech is we have this corporate base, we don't have startups. How do we get startups? For me, and one of the key points that I make in the book is that a lot of cities rightly see new firms as the answer to job creation, and over the long term, they're right. But I kind of take a different approach. I don't take a startup first approach or a founder first approach. I actually take a corporate first approach. How do we understand our corporate's needs? And then how do we find startups that fill those needs? And then what's the mechanism that gets those startups partnering with that corporate and growing together in Tulsa? And so through a series of conversations over many, many months, we worked with a venture capital firm out of Houston called EIC, Energy Innovation Capital, and our Fortune 500s in oil and gas. And we created EIC Rose Rock, which is a startup accelerator and venture fund and corporate innovation program focused on energy tech. And the idea is the innovation program works with our energy companies to understand their internal innovation needs. identifies startups and technological solutions to meet those needs. A startup accelerator incentivizes startups that meet those criteria to come to Tulsa, offer non-dilutive grants to underwrite their transition to Tulsa, and then has a venture fund that they could potentially tap to grow over time. And the way that we raised the money was we pitched this to the George Kaiser Family Foundation and secured a kind of matching grant of around $20 million, contingent upon my team raising an additional $20 million from other oil and gas companies. And if I'm being really honest, I don't think anybody thought we could do it. You know?
Yeah.
Like, I really honestly don't. I think that Tulsa Innovation Labs' success is still somewhat surprising to people in Tulsa. And it's a pure reflection of just the hard work and dedication of the team. And a community of champions that we have that really believe in the vision and the work and the community. But we did it. We got Williams, Devon, and One Oak to chip in $7.5 million each. And then a few months later, we got H&P to chip in $7.5 million as well, right? And being able to leverage social sector funding and go out and fundraise from our corporates stepped up. And particularly in a environment where we have a new presidential administration that will severely curtail federal funding, the philanthropy and corporations are going to have to step up into the economic development space because there won't be federal funding like we enjoyed at TIL during the Biden administration. Corporations and philanthropy are going to need to step up. But that's how we did it in the energy tech space. For advanced air mobility, you know, a majority of our funding came from winning President Biden's Build Back Better and Tech Hubs grants, historic large investments from the U.S. Department of Commerce and the Economic Development Administration, which also had philanthropic and university matching funds as well.
Thanks for laying that out. I love how you explain the corporate first approach, right? I mean, that's where the money from the region's coming from. So that makes perfect sense. And
they have the money. They already hire people. They have a historic presence, right? We need our corporates to grow and innovate and adapt and become more resilient. And I think that startups and new technologies is a way to do that. I think they know that too. But you need to understand the corporate needs first. You can't just go out and chase random startups or, as much as I think it's necessary over the long term, invest in unproven founders locally that want to start a bakery or a restaurant, right? That's not going to have the catalytic impact that cities need.
Nick, I want to go through, I still want to get to your leadership journey, but I do want to just highlight who should be checking this book out, okay? And maybe some cities, and within those cities, what organizations. So like, obviously I'm in Chicago, right? And what comes to mind seems like a perfect fit is 1871. And I think it's called P33, right? Those two organizations. Yeah. I think of when I went to Detroit, right? Detroit Venture Partners. I had Josh Linkner on the podcast before, who's very involved with kind of revitalizing Detroit. I know with Magic Johnson and Josh Linkner, and then I went to one of their offices, and Gabe Karp was one of the people involved. So
I think in Detroit, I think Michigan Central is doing great work with Ford and Google as well. I think about the audience in a few different ways. One, obviously, is urbanists like me, urban planners, economic developers, workforce developers, policy wonks, politicos. I think anybody working in tech and innovation, from engineers to business development to C-suite executives, I think would resonate with the book. I also think civic leaders, chambers of commerce, economic development organizations, municipal officials, philanthropists, folks that care about their community, that are investing in its future, I think need to read this book. And then I think finally, um, the big argument, right, is that America's innovation economy needs to be decentralized away from New York and San Francisco. That if America is going to prosper over the next 25 years and beyond, it's not going to be because of Silicon Valley. It's going to be because places like Detroit and Kansas City and Tulsa and Nashville are creating innovation economies of their own. And so to me, any American reader that cares about the long-term future and prosperity of the country should read this book as well.
I don't know where I heard this, Nick, but maybe it was someone on the podcast. I don't know. They were calling somewhere in Iowa Silicon Prairie. Have you heard that term before?
Yeah, can I tell you why I hate that?
Oh, okay, go ahead.
I hate it because, and I have an op-ed coming out. I don't know when, but what it does is it perpetuates the mythology, that a two-part mythology. One, that cities need to emulate Silicon Valley, which they don't, and they can't possibly do so. And second, it perpetuates the myth that America's innovation system is basically just Silicon Valley. And the entire point of my book is to make the argument that every city, particularly in the middle of the country, can find their own place in tech, but we're not creating Silicon Tulsa, right? Tulsa is becoming the best version of itself. They don't want to be San Francisco. They can't be San Francisco, even if they wanted to be San Francisco. And I've been told to my face by founders with cowboy hats, we don't want to be San Francisco, right? And so to me, it's less about Silicon Prairie or Heartland Prairie or Heartland Valley or whatever. It's building on a city's own assets and finding their own brand and their own identity within tech and being the best version of themselves. Sorry, I went on my little Silicon Valley rant.
I wish I would have started with that, because like that just brought out the
yeah.
That was great. Nick, I have one last question. I don't know if you have time for it, because I know we're at the top of the hour. I did want to hear a little bit about your leadership journey. If you have to hop off, I totally get it. But I did want to hit on, in the book, you do talk about your leadership journey, your personal leadership journey, if we have time for it.
Yeah, happy to. And
more rants, the better. So I appreciate that.
Well, you don't have to prompt me for a good rant. Look, I 5-6 years ago, I was still young, still in my 30s, still in my 30s now, but was younger, a young emerging leader when I started Tulsa Innovation Labs, and had built, I think, a reputation of doing really strong, high quality work. And Tulsa forced me to make a transition from doing good work to influencing ecosystems and building a shared vision for growth, which is different than writing a kick-ass memo or a PowerPoint slide, right? There's less deliverables and work products as a managing director or a founder. And I think I was slow to recognize that. And particularly as we're building TIL, I mean, we're literally building the plane as we're flying it. And so to me, the way that I've always built credibility and trust and respect is just by doing really good work, right? And treating people well. But there came a point kind of 2 years in where I really needed to make a harder transition to more strategic ecosystem-wide matters, delegate more, hire more staff, refine my role, re-envision how I can best deploy my strengths and mitigate my weaknesses. And what I think in writing the book, I think I came to realize, and honestly, I didn't really realize it when you're in the thick of it doing the work on a day-to-day basis, but this is a change management process for an entire city, right? It's a change management process for a $6 billion philanthropy that had never really done economic development work before. This is a change management process and experience for universities that don't have strong commercialization engines, right? And maybe because I was working on a fast, accelerated, impatient timeline, maybe because I was a young, immature leader, I don't think I fully appreciated all of that. And I think we got to a good place where really building a shared vision for growth requires bringing the community along with you. It's not just because, and I very quickly realized this, the city isn't going to just do whatever Nick wants or says because I think I'm smart and my team's great and I think we have a good idea. You have to really build trust and goodwill and bring them along with you. That obviously takes longer than I would prefer, but it's necessary for success. And I think that's important to recognize. I think the final point maybe that I'd say that I also discovered in Tulsa is that having an outside perspective enabled me to challenge the status quo in a way that locals weren't comfortable with, right? I could get away with stuff because I didn't go to school with him or her or know their grandparents or had lived next door for 30 years, right? I could be a bit of a straight shooter and tell people what I really thought, right? And call balls and strikes when I saw them. And I think for me, one of the takeaways in the book is that you don't necessarily need a punk like me to come from New York City to Tulsa, but you need to find leaders locally that can see cities and ecosystems from the outside in, who can have critical distance to challenge the status quo and to create a stronger, better, more prosperous path for cities. I think, and I write this in the book, and I think it's true. Look, and I think it's a hard truth, right? If you're looking to pivot to tech in 2025, then your economic development practices have not been working as well as you'd want them to. And that means you're going to need to adjust course. And for me, the whole point of urban reinvention is embracing change, embracing the future. And I think that requires leaders who can challenge the status quo and who can paint a positive forward-looking vision and bring people along with them.
Nick, I want to be the first one to thank you. Everyone check out Reinventing the Heartland. And you could check out nicholaslalla.com to learn more about Nick and what he's doing. And you can also connect with him on LinkedIn. Nick, thanks so much.
Thanks. This was fun.
What I got, you can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sand. And right now, I feel like $100 grand.